Hi, I'm Danny Duchamp, and today I am going to be responding to this video.
My recent video, The Fatal Flaw of Free Market Capitalism, has generated a healthy amount of discussion, in some circles anyway, and so this led me to performing a bunch of thought experiments, which were super fun, and so this video is the result. And just as a quick refresher, anarcho-capitalism is a stateless society where individuals are free to contract with each other and everything else is up to the free market. All the public services are privatized.
Yes, that is exactly what anarcho-capitalism is. Congratulations, Adam something, for not starting out with a straw man. You passed the first test. Perhaps it would be useful for me, though, to give a little bit more context to this. Anarcho-capitalism is a weird position. It's kind of strange to say that you are an anarchist, much stranger to say that you're an anarcho-capitalist. Anarcho-capitalism is not the same kind of anarchism that you're used to seeing if you've seen Antifa smashing windows or anything like that. Anarchism in that view is opposed to rules, it seems, at least on some level. It's a little incoherent, so don't expect that to be consistent. Whereas anarcho-capitalists are opposed to rulers. We think that a market process can result in a set of laws that people will follow without having a specific government constructing those laws. So the thing about weird positions, about positions that most people don't have, is they're usually wrong, right? Don't take this too far. You should definitely deviate from that when the evidence is strong enough. But by default, you should assume that things that other people believe are true. You might think of all the things that people are wrong about and say that this is wrong, but that's because you're probably thinking about controversial political statements. You're not thinking about the average thing that people believe. The sky is blue, grass is green, humans are corporeal. I don't know. Most individual beliefs people have are true. And therefore, as a default assumption, if you're going to deviate more from the standard belief of other people, then you should have stronger reason to believe it, and you should be more eager to question it. So because I have a specific belief that deviates very heavily from the majority of people, I have to be careful. I have to think, in what way could I be missing something that other people are seeing? And in order to try to achieve that, to make sure that I've done my due diligence, I'm going to be looking at some specifically anti-Ancap videos or other content and trying to respond to that content and see if I can adequately address the concerns that they raise. So that's what we'll be doing here. Just to expand a little bit on what Adam said there about what anarcho-capitalism is, I should give some basic kind of defense of it. Essentially, it comes down to this. When the government controls the production of food, people starve. Right, we saw that with like the Soviet Union or other attempts to completely nationalize food production. In general, when you see that the government in your country provides some service that is worse than a privately provided service, right? Just think about going to your DMV or whatever your country has as an equivalent. Dealing with government services tends to suck. Why does government tend to suck at providing services? Well, that's because it's not subject to market forces. Market forces is when a company can't succeed unless it gets your dollars. To get your dollars, it needs to convince you to give those dollars up. To convince you to give those dollars up, it must provide you with good services. Now, the government doesn't do this. When the government provides you with a bad service, you still have to pay, right? They charge via taxes, which you pay whether you like the service, whether you even use the service, the government will still charge you. That's why government services tend to suck. There's no reason that law, as a service, should be exempt from this general pattern. And so anarcho-capitalists think that there is a way to structure a market so that the law can be provided by private entities, and therefore the law and the enforcement thereof will be better, right? Because just as we see government sucks at providing services, it can't create these big production chains and companies that provide all the lovely goods and services that we need, so the law would be better if it was produced on the private market. That's the general gist. In any case, let's continue on with this video here from Adam Something and see if he can't change my mind on that.
And I was rather curious as to how this would work in real life. Now, one thing that Ancaps like to bring up to help support the viability of their ideology is the so-called Icelandic Commonwealth, which was, for all intents and purposes, a proto-Ancap society in the
Okay, the Icelandic Commonwealth is not an example that's primary to anarcho-capitalist advocacy. When David Friedman, one of the earlier progenitors of the idea of anarcho-capitalism, was looking into history, he started to find some examples of societies which had some commonalities with the idea that was being advocated for by Ancaps, including himself. That isn't to say that what we advocate for is just going back to the medieval Icelandic system. Ultimately, the thing that we're advocating for is a new system. So this is not the primary piece of an ANCAP advocacy. That being said, I'm not averse to it being brought up.
Middle Ages. Now, it did manage to exist from 930 until 1262/63, when the Icelanders apparently voted to ask the King of Norway to take over their country. And to quote from the Icelandic Commonwealth's Wikipedia page from the Decline and Fall section, in the early 13th century, the age of the Sturlungs, the Commonwealth began to suffer from chaos and division resulting from internal disputes. Originally, the Goddard chieftains functioned more as a contractual relationship than a fixed geographic chieftaincy. However, by 1220, this form of communal leadership was replaced by dominant regional individuals who battled with one another for more control. One historian argues that the chaos and violence of this period stem from an imbalance of power and changes in the nature of Icelandic warfare. Whereas the number of Goddard had been at least 39 in the early Icelandic Commonwealth, a few powerful families had consolidated control over most of the Goddard in the late 12th century. Now, I don't know about you, but this to me sounds awfully familiar. And my favorite part about this is...
Hold on. This
I don't know
sounds...
about you, but this to me sounds awfully familiar.
Okay, he's saying that the consolidation of power by a bunch of Icelandic leaders is similar to these companies creating large organizations. So Adam Something is using this graphic that comes, I believe, from the Oxfam website, where they weirdly enough refer to it as the illusion of choice. I say that's weird because it includes 10 of the companies that provide most of the food at grocery stores, and so that gives you 10 different companies worth of choices, and that's just the biggest ones. There are, of course, other smaller competitors. He's trying to compare this to the Goddard, the chieftains in Icelandic society, towards the end of the society, where the society started to break down, as all societies eventually do. And he's trying to say that the Goddard, in that case, are a good analogy for these large companies. The problem is that the Wikipedia article that Adam Something cites referred to the Goddard as regional monopolies towards the end of Icelandic society, as opposed to decentralized contractual relationships. Which is, of course, what these companies are. You purchase some product from Unilever because you wanted to purchase that product, not because they are the monopoly food provider in your area. But of course, Adam's real criticism here lies in the fact that those regional monopolies did form. So why did that happen? The reason that that happened, as you seem to be kind of going into, is mostly because of the infiltration of a foreign ideology, which was monarchy, right? Everyone started to believe that it is inevitable that a king shall reign. And once people believe that it is inevitable, then it starts to actually be a self-fulfilling prophecy. You know, people start going, well, seeing as how this is all going to turn to one central ruler, I'd better be that central ruler, or my guy had better be that central ruler. And so that in itself starts to break down the society. This is a way that any society could break down, right? A ideology that is exogenous develops popularity among the people, and therefore that society collapses. Stateless and state societies with and without governments, have both collapsed in this way, pointing to the fact that a society that has some things in common with anarcho-capitalism eventually succumbs to the same thing that also ends plenty of state societies is not a strong argument in favor of a state.
And my favorite part about this is that the Icelandic Commonwealth failed so hard in the end that people ended up inviting a foreign despot to invade their land, because even that was preferable to living in Icelandic Ancapistan.
Okay, no, it's not that it got so bad and it was just so unpleasant for everyone that they just wanted a king to take over and sort it all out. First of all, even a king, right? A king was the default at the time. It's not as though they had the example of tons of countries around them becoming republics or whatever you favor. The king was the default standard at the time. And it's not as though everything was so unpleasant in Iceland that therefore they just needed the king to come and take over. They believed the king was inevitable. All right, so that's It's an entirely different thing. It doesn't show that it's unpleasant in a, as you call it, proto-Ancap society. It also doesn't show that proto-Ancap society is more susceptible to collapsing, because it's the same sort of thing that leads to a lot of societies collapsing. In case that's a dubious claim to you, think of every society that's ever had a revolution of any kind. That's the same thing. The people change ideologies. They no longer support the current power structure, and therefore they will revolt and replace it.
Now, this was in part a result of the King of Norway exerting pressure on Iceland for a longer time, so some might say that this is cheating and thus isn't fair criticism. But this line of thinking leaves us with three possible options as to why Icecapistan fell. Number one would be because of the Nordic invasion, number two because people were manipulated into voting for the takeover, and number three because people misjudged the situation and made their own call at the ballot box. And I have bad news for Ancaps. All these options prove my point. They show you that an Ancap society would either fall victim to a state's well-organized invasion force, or get subverted by propaganda, or people will vote on a feels over reals basis and end up screwing themselves over.
Yes, because no society with government has ever succumbed to invasion, manipulation, or ignorance. A very good point.
Brexit. And I personally think that if a country would transition into the Ancap model somewhere, a military intervention scenario would be its most likely end. And it would be super convenient too. I mean, there would be no state to declare war on. There is no state. You just roll in with the tanks and announce martial law. Even if some people would resist, it would just be a handful of loosely coordinated militias, if that, against a regular army. And of course, if you have some kind of very powerful high-tech military hardware, you need a very complicated logistics chain to maintain it. You know, Billy Joe can't just tow a Reaper drone to his shack to recalibrate his targeting AI or something. What an average Ancap commune could do at most is maintain or create small arms and crude explosives, maybe. So the Ancap dream stumbles right at the starting line.
Holy shit. Okay, look, what we see is that private organization can produce larger production chains, more advanced technology, can produce greater wealth. Right? That's what we see in reality. Given that, it's kind of weird that you would just claim out of the gate that privately run defense is going to be able to, at best, be a couple of, muskets and small weapons like that against an army with well-equipped. No, a privately run defense force is going to be better equipped than a government one. Now, maybe you disagree with that, but you haven't shown that, right? You haven't given us some thought experiment where it's like, oh, I quite see how a government would have to have a better defense force. No, right? You've given us no reason at all to think that this is any different from the normal case where the private market would produce something more efficiently than the government.
And right here, right now, I could just stop bothering with all this, but I'd like to dig a little bit deeper. Let's give it all to Ancaps, the most ideal scenario imaginable for the emergence of real-life anarcho-capitalism. An imaginary world where every country transitioned into anarcho-capitalism at the exact same time, all corporations were completely dissolved,
I thought you wanted it to be ideal. Right, like existing corporations, as in like business structures and relationships, all of that stuff that produces all of those great things that capitalism produces, all that's dissolved? It's not ideal. Ideal would be that the private market that has produced all of the wealth we see around us continues to operate, and we just diminish the government's role into it until that role reaches zero. Nuclear weapons disarmed, I'm not anti-nuke. I know a lot of anarcho-capitalists are, and a lot of statists are also, but that's one seems weird also.
All nuclear weapons were disarmed, and all complex military hardware beyond small arms was disposed of.
Okay, again, why? Right, large arms, tanks, jets, and drones, etc. are not a bad thing, right? People should be able to own those sorts of things. We are going to need some kind of defense system. It could be decentralized, it could be charitably funded, it could be insurance funded, it may be community funded. However, that's not to say that we should dismantle it all, right? Just because it isn't going to be provided by the government does not mean we do not want it to be provided at all. We are still in favor of defense, including tanks, jets, and drones.
All you have is people living freely with their guns, ready to enter into voluntary contracts with each other, having inherited all the infrastructure built out by the now dissolved governments, and everyone getting a fresh start at capitalism.
Okay, so the infrastructure, I don't know, that doesn't really matter. Government infrastructure is shite. We get to inherit some crumbling roads, but we don't get all of the existing corporate arrangements that That doesn't seem like an ideal system in any way. Like, I'm fine. I think that anarcho-capitalism under these conditions would do well, but I'm just saying this is not ideal by any stretch.
So I believe that this would be a perfect, or at least near perfect, condition for anarcho-capitalism.
You are wrong.
How will things work out? Let's take a look. Wait, what's this? Oh! So our little simulation will have two relevant parameters. Number one is that everybody will act according to their rational self-interest. Number two, there will be no Deus Ex Machina type situations, meaning everything will develop organically as a logical continuation of the events that happened before.
Okay, so if anything that you mention does not logically follow, then you have some Deus Ex Machina and you are thereby in violation of your rules. I just want that to be really clear. So Deus Ex Machina, right? It's something just happening with no good logical explanation, just so that your thought experiment can lead to your desired conclusion. That you're not going to do. Okay, no Deus Ex Machina. We shall see.
So over here we have a network of smaller settlements, each operating their own basic infrastructure, just like during medieval times. In these settlements, eventually some people start getting more successful at capitalism than others. Let's call them great men. And we'll be focusing on one of them, this fellow called Billy Bob, living in the town of Ainvale. Now Ainvale does have its own little water system, but the water quality is not the greatest. Now Billy Bob runs a saloon in town, and he thinks the water quality is hindering his sales because it makes his liquor taste worse. And to help run his business smoother, using his knowledge of distillers, he puts together a water purifier so he can disconnect from the local water system and save money, and also have better tasting liquor. Now his water purifier ends up being a success, able to produce large quantities of water with a low energy cost, which is somewhat even better quality than the water from the system. Now he produces more water than he needs by a considerable margin, so he starts selling it off to people.
Okay, prediction. You're just going to go into a situation where Billy Bob eventually owns all of the water supply, and that's really bad for everyone. That's just my prediction. Let's go on and see if you do that.
Those profits, plus his increased revenue from liquor sales, he puts together a second machine in his free time. This time he works out some of the bugs, and the new machine turns out to be slightly more efficient and produces even better quality water. He now sells a lot of water and makes large amounts of money. Now Billy Bob is forward-thinking and keeps reinvesting his revenue back into his business. With his profits, he buys a plot of land behind the saloon and builds a huge water storage tank. He also builds out pipes to the farmlands nearby and starts selling his water to the farmers. With his increasing profits, he hires workers to build and maintain water purifiers. Soon enough, he has enough capital to offer a handsome amount for the local water system. The owners like his offer and sell him all their infrastructure. After all, they weren't making as much money on it anyway, they didn't really know what they were doing, the water quality was bad, they had a large maintenance backlog, and most people in Ainvale just went on collecting rainwater and boiling it anyway. So they are more than happy to just pull the golden parachute and get rid of all their problems. And
I just want to remind you that you just gave a way that people can get water without reliance on Billy Bob. So when inevitably your fantasy about a water monopoly develops, I hope that you don't forget about the rainwater.
And go on to do something else. Following the acquisition, Billy Bob founds the Bill and Robert Water Company. Now everyone in town is his current or potential customer. Billy Bob has his workers connect his purifiers to the system, filling the pipes with his water. He also spends on maintenance, replacing rusty pipes and leaky valves, which increases the water quality and reduces water loss. His customer base starts to grow rapidly. People happily sign the contract stating that they'll get the water cheaper than under the previous owners and at a guaranteed higher quality. They can also disconnect from Billy Bob's pipes for the equivalent of $1,000 as a service fee, but why would they? The water is cheap and great. As time goes on, other people try to get in on the water business too, offering their own water from their own purifiers. Only a few people switch over though, since Billy Bob's water is reasonably priced and of high quality, and there is a $1,000 disconnect fee which nobody wants to pay.
Okay, so what if they just don't offer the $1,000 disconnect fee, right? His competitors don't. Unless you're saying that Billy Bob has already got everyone in town on board before the first competitor starts up, a highly dubious prospect, then I don't really see how people would sign with Billy Bob. Wait, you've got a $1,000 disconnect fee, Billy Bob? But this other guy over here, he says he's going to purify my water, no disconnect fee. Like, I don't think I want to be dependent on you like that, Billy Bob. Right? So Billy Bob would not be able to charge such a disconnection fee. It would not be a good business strategy.
But then a true prodigy appears, an even greater man who creates a water purifier that's even better than Billy Bob's. Worse, he starts selling the water from it, and some people actually switch over and they are very satisfied with the water. It's even cheaper and even better quality. And this even greater man even starts making some money on his business, sucking away profits from Billy Bob. Now Billy Bob gets word of this, so he visits this prodigy personally and offers to buy out his business, but he gets rejected. Now the actions of this prodigy directly threaten Billy Bob's business. He must neutralize this threat as soon as he can. Billy Bob goes on to use his considerable wealth and leverage to artificially lower the price of water even below the competitor's price. Although he goes into the red somewhat, he has enough money stockpiled to survive. The prodigy less so by virtue of being a small business. He also has to lower his price to compete, otherwise nobody would buy water from him. His customers start to dwindle, many switching back over to Billy Bob, who announces a $500 water coupon bonus to be given to all returning customers. After months of losses, the prodigy is at the end of his rope. He spent every bit of money on keeping his business alive. He sold absolutely everything he could, now living on the barest of necessities in an empty apartment, perhaps 1 month away from eviction. At this point, Billy Bob visits him again and makes a new offer. A very pretty sum of cash for his business and a lucrative upper management position within the Bill and Robert Water Company, together with a luxury executive penthouse. He will also have access to a very generous innovation fund which he can use to invent even better water purifiers. And this time he doesn't have to worry about not being able to pay the bills if his inventions prove unsuccessful. Billy Bob takes all the financial risks and the prodigy is free to unleash his creative genius. What's better, for every innovation he gets a huge bonus, with the added caveat that all of them will be the property of the Bill and Robert Water Company and cannot be made open source. The prodigy has to make a choice. He can refuse, go broke, get evicted in a month, and sleep under the bridge wrapped in a filthy blanket, hungry and sick, torturing himself with the thought of the dream he lost. Or he can continue his life's work of inventing purifiers and fulfill his dreams in a position of prestige and wealth, high salary, luxury penthouse, generous bonuses, freedom to innovate, and all he needs to do for this is sign the dotted line.
Or alternatively, he can go to a bunch of other investors and say, hey, I'm clearly killing this guy's business. This is one of the biggest businesses in town, and I am beating it. He's actually selling at a loss to try to prolong the battle. And like, if you just invest in my company, you just keep us going. And then when he can no longer sell at a loss, which can't take that long, most businesses can't continue to sell at a loss forever, then we're going to reap the rewards. What about that? You see, most, in fact, almost all of these fantasies about how free markets will lead to monopolies, they have a deus ex machina, but it is a subtler one. Instead of giving some description of some ridiculous, impossible event, they have a ridiculous and impossible omission of possible events. They have a situation where you'll just only focus on what this one guy is doing, the monopolist, and just completely ignore the fact that this is an economy full of thousands, if you look internationally, billions, and there's no reason not to involve international capital, billions of other people, all of whom you can go to, who you can do other deals with. There is no person who is going to be able to sell at a loss against the power of the entire rest of the world in any kind of situation. Actually, you know what? This has been done before in real life, right? This has been attempted. There was a time when there was this company called Standard Oil, often called a monopoly, though it was no such thing. And people accused it of doing the exact same thing that Billy Bob here is supposedly going to be doing. Maybe I should read you a little excerpt from the same guy who first pointed out the similarities between medieval Icelandic society and anarcho-capitalism. David Friedman goes into the history here. So let me read that little excerpt for you. What about the situation where the monopoly engages in regional price cutting, taking a loss in the area where I am operating and making it up in other parts of the country? If I am seriously worried about that prospect, I can take the precaution of opening outlets in all his major markets. Even if I do not, the high prices he charges in other areas in order to make up for his losses against me will make those areas very attractive to other new firms. Once they are established, he no longer has a market in which to make up his losses. Thus, the artificial monopoly, which tries to use its size to maintain its monopoly, is in a sad position, as US Steel, which was formed with 60% of total steel production, but which now has about 25%, found out to its sorrow. It has often been claimed that Rockefeller used such tactics to build Standard Oil, but there seems to be little or no evidence for the charge. Standard Oil officials occasionally tried to use the threat of cutting prices and starting price wars in an attempt to persuade competitors to keep their production down and their prices up, but the competitors understood the logic of the situation better than later historians, as shown by the response quoted by McGee of the manager of the corn planter refining company to such a threat. "Well," I says, "Mr. Moffat, I am very glad you put it that way, because if it is up to you, the only way you can get it," it being the business, "is to cut the market," i.e. reduce prices, "and if you cut the market, I will cut you for 200 miles around, and I will make you sell the stuff." And I says, "I don't want a bigger picnic than that. Sell it if you want to," and I bid him good day and left. The threat never materialized. Indeed, it appears from McGee's evidence that price cutting more often was started by the small independent firms in an attempt to cut into Standard's market, and that many of them were quite successful. Corn planters' capital grew in 20 years from 10,000 to 450,000. As McGee says, commenting on the evidence presented against Standard Oil in the 1911 antitrust case, it is interesting that most of the ex-Standard employees who testified about Standard's deadly predatory tactics entered the oil business when they left Standard. They also prospered. So that's the quote, and I think it speaks rather clearly that the idea of predatory pricing is kind of a boogeyman. It can be used as a threat, but the competitors that you're competing with will understand the economics of it better than the historians who will later analyze it, and therefore they will know that it doesn't really work. You can't keep selling at a loss forever. You need to make it up in some other markets, and in those other markets, you are thereby increasing your prices above what your competitors can provide. So predatory pricing simply does not work. It is not a viable way of creating or maintaining a monopoly.
And he does. He becomes general manager of the Bill and Robert Water Company, gets a beautiful penthouse where just the bathroom is twice as big as his entire previous apartment. As promised, he gets to tinker with his designs on the side and gets huge bonuses for his work. He becomes a respected member of the community and everyone admires him for his talents. And Billy Bob now controls the town's entire water market. He stops the price dumping and returns to making massive profits, now even more since the prodigy helps increase the efficiency.
Okay, and now that he's had to put his prices back up, there is nothing to stop other competition from coming in to, well, compete with him.
But aside from doing his business, Billy Bob also likes to read, mainly about great men in the past and what they did to succeed. He comes across the idea of buying out as much of the production chain as possible, the chain that supplies the business, that is. So Billy Bob might be selling the water, but it's not his company that manufactures the pipes, or mines the ore to smelt the metal, or makes the parts for the purifiers. And so he goes on to acquire as many of these enterprises as possible using the same tactic, offering management positions and large salaries. By the time he's done, he can build out a water supply system from scratch just using his company resources. He now owns mines, foundries, machine building workshops.
Vertical integration is what you're talking about. It's when a company might want to own more of its production chain. It's not always better for a business to just own more. The more that a business owns, the more of the production chain the business owns, the more unwieldy the business becomes. You get diseconomies of scale. Diseconomies of scale are a well-known concept in economics. They're essentially the opposite of economies of scale. Economies of scale are savings that large firms get as compared to small firms, and diseconomies of scale are costs that large firms get as compared to small firms. Some examples of diseconomies of scale are communication costs. The larger an organization is, the more costly it is to communicate between all of the different members of the firm and get them all on the same page. Duplication of effort becomes more likely in a large firm. It's more likely that you'll have a bunch of different people all kind of doing the same thing redundantly. Office politics is another one. More people there are, the more difficult it is to get along. Supply chain disruptions. Often small firms will be more able to respond well to supply chain disruptions, not just because they can be more nimble, because they can communicate better, but also because they usually will be less vertically integrated. They won't be relying on their own internal supply chains. They can simply go to a different provider when one provider falls through. This is by no means an exhaustive list. The point is that there are some costs that large firms have to pay which small firms do not, and that's why economies of scale don't allow big firms to grow indefinitely. They just grow until the diseconomies of scale balance the economies of scale.
workshops and optimizes their production for his goals. Those enterprises might suffer losses due to this, but the water company gets materials much cheaper and the gains far outpace the losses, which Billy Bob of course ends up cross-subsidizing. But Billy Bob doesn't stop there. He becomes obsessed with control. He now owns all of his production chain but decides he wants more. But what else can he acquire? Well, the other end of course. His biggest customers are farmers who use his water for irrigation. With Billy Bob's advanced irrigation systems made by his foundries and workshops, the farms grew to the point where they could not sustain themselves with their own wells anymore, and so they became dependent on Billy Bob's water. But hey, it's a great deal, so they're not complaining. Billy Bob founds the Bill and Robert Agricultural Company and starts buying out.
Okay, so I kind of get where this is going. I don't know if I really want to go through this very belabored explanation, but yeah, so Billy Bob ends up buying up the entire town. With one town, it is kind of plausible. Like even company towns back in the day, when you had like, I don't know, mining town, it wouldn't be one company that owned the entire town, right? That doesn't actually happen. But I can see in principle, like maybe one town it could happen. However, at that point, it's going to be like an abnormality. And additionally, it's going to be a situation where people can very easily leave it. It's not going to be too large. So it's just like a town. And yeah, it seems temporary as well. In any case, yeah, if one company just starts to own an entire town, then like that's vaguely possible. However, it's unlikely. The reason it's unlikely is because of that same Deus Ex Machina that you are failing to recognize that you're using. You just have this one guy who's making all these purchases. Is there no one else in the entire town making purchases? No one can outbid him? No one from outside? Anywhere else in the entire world? There is not a single person who is also interested in this town. That seems kind of implausible. If Billy Bob is not going to make a profit, then what the hell is he doing investing? He's going to lose all his money. If he is going to make a profit, there's an incentive for other capitalists from outside to come in and try to invest to compete. So yeah, there is a Deus Ex Machina. I think probably you're just going to... Okay, look, if you see the screenshots here, he's buying up a town. Oh, he's building a wall. Okay, let's see what you say at the end.
The new unspoken rule spreads around town. Billy Bob will give you law and order, stability and prosperity, but for that you must pay your dues and not question his authority under any circumstances.
Okay, yeah, he turns into a despotic regime. First of all, the nightmare scenario of anarcho-capitalism is we just end up with another government. Maybe you think that we'd end up with a worse one, but there's no reason to think that, right? Like some monarchies aren't so bad. Some monarchies are really bad. Some democracies aren't so bad. Some democracies are really bad. So, governments seem to be better or worse, irrespective of what kind of governments they are. So even if you're arguing that in anarcho-capitalist societies that one guy is inevitably just going to buy everything and he just becomes the monarch, maybe it'll be better than the status quo, maybe it'll be worse. I really don't know. Let's see, I'm going to watch to the end here and see if you have any other points, and I will edit in if you have anything else to say.
Those who do.
Okay, he does have one more point. It's the power vacuum point, so...
And why wouldn't we? Capitalism is fundamentally based on a government-like hierarchy, one that isn't democratic. So once you introduce a power vacuum by ending the government, it makes sense that capitalism will fill that vacuum, but this time with a truly autocratic structure.
Two issues with that. Number one, capitalism is not fundamentally based on a hierarchical structure. Capitalism is a decentralized structure. It is a system which allocates resources based on the demand of the market. If people want something, then you will be able to rise in the system only so long as you are providing that thing that people want. That's not a hierarchical system in the sense that someone at the top tells you to bake bread and tells you to get steel. That's decentralized. Now, within that decentralized structure, you do tend to get hierarchical structures, right? You do get businesses which will have like an owner, and he will have employees, and if it's larger, they may have middle management between them. So there will be a tree structure, a hierarchical structure. However, that's the case simply because that's an efficient mode of organization of humans, right? There's nothing about capitalism which necessitates a hierarchical structure. It's just that those hierarchical structures tends to be an efficient organizational structure. And the other problem there, of course, is that a monarchy is not like clearly worse than a democracy. Like there are monarchical societies right now. I'm not saying they're as good as the Western democratic republics, but they're certainly better than a lot of other democratic republics. Like look at some African ones. There's some really bad examples of those too. So yeah, I don't think it's that clear that democracy is better than monarchy. In any case, that's kind of a side point because I'm advocating for neither. And you've given us no reason to expect that capitalism results in monarchy. So basically, that's the gist. The system that we advocate for, that anarcho-capitalists advocate for, is privatized law, decentralized order. This seems to be not entirely a straw man. Like, it's not... I've seen much worse responses to anarcho-capitalism, but he did violate his own rules with the no Deus Ex Machina thing. I do want to do more of these. I want to do more of these responses. I want to see if there are any pieces of content, whether it's videos, articles, or whatever else, that maybe will offer a better argument against anarcho-capitalism. If you happen to know one, please post it in the comments section below, and maybe I will get round to it. Alright, bye.